G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Lamentations. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into the final session of the Book of Lamentations. We're into chapter 5, verses 1 to 22. It's only a fairly short lesson today, but we'll finish it off. Now, we're going to look at the prayer of Jeremiah, and this is the whole chapter virtually. Although this chapter is 22 verses, remember chapters 1, 2, and 4 also had 22 verses, but in those chapters we had that assonance, where we had the first letter of the word was the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That's not like that in chapter 5. We don't have to deal with any specific Hebrew words and their meanings. There are two main parts to this final lamentation. Two main sections. We're going to have the prophet's sorrow, which is going to be from verse 1 to verse 18. And then we're going to have the prayer of restoration, which is in verses 19 to 22. So we're going to look at the prophet's sorrow. There are two main parts now to the prophet's sorrow, and this is divided into three sections. First section is the condition of the remnant, which we're going to see in chapter 5, verses 1 to 10. Remember, O Jehovah, what is come upon us. Behold and see our reproach. Our inheritance is turned unto strangers, our houses unto aliens. We're orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We've drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Our pursuers are upon our necks. We are weary and we have no rest. We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Our fathers sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. Servants rule over us. There is none to deliver us out of their hand. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin is black like an oven, because of the burning heat of famine. Now remember, this is after the Babylonian destruction of Judah and Jerusalem and the temple. So this is what this lamentation is all about. So the condition of the remnant is given here in these first 10 verses. Verse 1 is simply a plea for mercy. Remember, O Jehovah, what has come upon us. Behold and see our reproach or our shame. The judgment, this calamity, was brought upon them by God. So it was highly unlikely that he had forgotten their plight. But what this is actually a plea for mercy and for God to act on their behalf. In verses 2 to 5, he describes the misery of the remnant in 4 areas. First of all, concerning property. In verse 2, our inheritance is turned unto strangers, our houses unto aliens. Now, their property had been taken away. Now, Mosaic law forbid families from selling the family inheritance, the family land, their houses, their land. If sold for debt, it had to be purchased by a kinsman or other family members. But their land had now been parceled out to strangers. People who do not belong to us have taken over our houses. Aliens, strangers, are now living in our houses. Second concern, the families. Verse 3, it says, we are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. The men of Judah had either died or had been deported to Babylon. Some were in hiding, and others were taken away to perform forced labor. They left behind their children as fatherless orphans and their wives as widows. In Israel, orphans and widows were the most vulnerable people in society, who were the most in need of protection. But Babylon was their cruel overlord. They now had no one to stand up for their rights or to ensure that justice was being done. And third, concerning economics, verse 4, we have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Now, Babylonian control was so strong and so rigid that they had to pay for the use of their own water and their own wood. According to Deuteronomy 29:11, Deuteronomy 29:11, foreigners could cut wood and carry water for the people of Israel. But now all that has changed, and foreigners made the people pay for what had been theirs by right. And fourth, concerning freedom of movement in verse 5, our pursuers are upon our necks. We are weary and have no rest. Literally, it means on our necks we are persecuted. That is, men tread on our necks. That's what it means. Men tread on our necks. All attempts to escape failed, since the Babylonian soldiers who pursued the escapees were always close. The constant fleeing caused weariness, and there was nowhere to rest and to recover. Then in verses 6 to 7, Jeremiah deals with the causes of the misery. There are two causes of the misery. First of all, we see in verse 6, it was their sins. We have given the hand to the Egyptians and to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Their sin was trusting in the help of foreign nations rather than trusting in their God. At times, they would side with the Egyptians, and at other times with the Assyrians, hoping to receive enough bread to survive, hoping to receive the help to survive. Second cause of Judah's misery is the sins of past generations, in verse 7. Our fathers sinned, and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. So what we see here is the consequences of the sins of the fathers now continue on to later generations. The sin that led to Judah's destruction began with the fathers who had long since passed on. Now the current generation was paying the price of their forefathers' iniquities. Now, in keeping with Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7, the consequences of sin continued in their effects upon subsequent generations. However, as we saw in Jeremiah's prophetic book, the generation of his day, of Jeremiah's day, continued in the sins of their forefathers, and they became just as guilty as they were. We find this in Jeremiah 16, verse 12, and Jeremiah 32, verse 18. 31:30, I see on the PowerPoint there. Now, in verses 8 to 10, he describes some further miseries of the remnant. He describes these miseries of the remnant in three areas. First, concerning oppression, in verse 8. Servants rule over us. There is none to deliver us out of their hand. So servants have now become the rulers. Now, servants under the Chaldean governors rule the Jews, and we see this, for instance, in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 15. But it could also refer here to the Jewish servants like Gedaliah. Remember Gedaliah, who had been appointed by Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to rule over Judah, even though he was not part of the Davidic line, but he was appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to be governor over Judah. So it could be, the servants could be Jewish leaders who were raised up to rule over them as well. And second, concerning the search for food in verse 9, we get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Now, while bread or food was essential for survival, in order to gain it, the survivors of Judah had to risk their lives. In other words, to go out to hunt for food is to be exposed to the ravaging of the Babylonian soldiers and other enemies like the Bedouin Arabs of the wilderness. So they were always under threat, because remember, they weren't producing anything. Everything was destroyed. And third, concerning famine, in verse 10, our skin is black like an oven because of the burning heat of famine. So their skin was like a baker's oven. Now, the figure of skin that turned dark due to starvation, we've seen this before back in chapter 4, verse 8. What happens is hunger dries up the pores, so the skin becomes like as if it were scorched by the sun. And this verse here adds the burning heat of famine, and this refers to the fever heat produced by extreme hunger. Now we see the effects of the fall on Jerusalem's society in verses 11 to 14. They ravaged the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Princes were hanged up by their hand. The faces of elders were not honored. The young men bare the mill, and the children stumbled under the wood. The elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. Now, having pleaded with God to consider their suffering, the people of Judah detailed the effects that the fall of Jerusalem had on them. The effects upon Jerusalem's society, first of all, were on the women in verse 11. They ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Hebrew term for ravished here, inu, I-double-N-U, comes from the verb ana, meaning to defile. And we see this back in Genesis 34:2, and Ezekiel 22:10-11, just two of the examples there. In this case, when it speaks about them being defiled like this, the defiling here was done by sexual assault. Both women, married and virgins, were raped during the takeover by the soldiers. Second, on the nobility in verse 12, princes were hanged up by their hand. The faces of the elders were not honored. Now, to be hung up and die on a tree was considered a very shameful death for a Jew, according to Deuteronomy 21:22-23, and also 1 Samuel 31, verses 10-12. No reverence or respect were shown to elders in age or office. They were all treated with contempt. Third thing we see is that they also had to undergo forced labor in verse 13. It says, the young men bare the mill, and the children stumbled under the wood. So the work of the lowest female slave, which was grinding at the mill, was now laid upon the young men. Remember, Samson was made to grind in the Philistine prison house, back in Judges 16, verse 21. Barely old enough to gather sticks, the children stumbled under the heavy burdens of wood. Now, fourth, there was also a cessation of some common practices in verse 14. First of all, the elders ceased gathering at the gate. The elders have ceased from the gate. The elders in the East meet in the open space around the gate to decide judicial trials or to serve as witnesses for legal matters or to pass judgment at the gate. This ceased. They just did not meet there anymore. And second, we see the young men from their music. The young men no longer danced to the music, indicating that all festivities had now ended. The cause of the sorrow we find in verses 15-18. The joy of our heart is ceased. Our dance is turned into mourning. The crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. For this our heart is faint. For these things our eyes are dim. For the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. In verse 15, Jeremiah says that there was a cessation of merriment. There was both internal and external sadness. The joy of our heart, that's internal sadness or internal mourning. Our dance is turned into mourning. That's the external sadness, demonstrating what was happening on the internal. In verse 16, it says, the crown is fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. Judah's crown had fallen. It means that the people had lost the leadership of a king. There was no king anymore. They recognized that they were to be blamed for this situation. And once again, their sins had led to this particular judgment. In verse 17, their depression over Jerusalem is described. For this our heart is faint. For these things our eyes are dim. The fact that the hearts became faint indicates that the people were depressed. The fact that the eyes grew dim shows the external results of depression. And because of these things and because of Jerusalem's fall, they have now entered into a deep depression. And in verse 18, the desolation is described. For the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. The expression mountain of Zion may refer to Jerusalem as a whole, but more likely it focuses on the Temple Mount. This mount had become desolate, and foxes now walked upon it. Now, in Jewish culture, foxes were proverbial destroyers. We can see this in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 3, where Nehemiah says, Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, Even that which they are building, if a fox go up, he shall break down their stone wall. So foxes are seen as proverbial destroyers. We see now the destruction of Jerusalem did not come without warning, because we have back in Leviticus 26, 27 to 33. I'll read that for you here, and just listen to it. And if you will not for all this hearken unto me, this was a warning by Moses. And if you will not for all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I'll walk contrary unto you in wrath, and I also will chastise you 7 times for your sins. And you shall eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters shall you eat. And I'll destroy your high places, and cut down your sun images, and cast your dead bodies upon the bodies of your idols. And my soul shall abhor you. And I'll make your cities a waste, and will bring your sanctuaries unto desolation. And I'll not smell the savour of your sweet odours. And I'll bring the land into desolation, and your enemies that dwell therein shall be astonished at it. And you will I scatter among the nations, and I will draw out the sword after you. And your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Now, this was back in Leviticus that Moses warned them. And this passage here vividly foreshadows the exact things that happened to Judah at the time of the Babylonian conquest. It also shows that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple occurred as part of a continuous covenantal relationship with the God of Israel. Had Judah kept the law and refrained from the sins of the fathers, the destruction could have been delayed. Yet, as grave as the situation was for the Jewish people, this truth also contains hope, because if the nation repented and returned to the Lord, it could be restored. And now we see in the last 3 verses, verses 19 to 22, we see the prayer for restoration. After describing Judah's plight in verses 2 to 18, the prayer now concludes by imploring God to intervene. Thou, O Jehovah, abidest forever. Thy throne is from generation to generation. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever, and forsake us so long time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Jehovah, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. Now, verse 19 describes the eternality of God. You, O Jehovah, abides forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. So the foundation of their prayer here is that it is God's eternal sovereignty. And this eternal sovereignty of God raises a question in verse 20. Wherefore do you forget us forever and forsake us so long time? If we were to paraphrase this, it would be, considering the fact that you, O Lord, rule forever, why do you forget us forever? Why have you forsaken us so long? This was their plea to God. Now, God's ability to restore the nation was beyond doubt. As the sovereign of history, he had control over the fate of his own people. But the prayer here contains 2 rhetorical questions that build upon this truth and require a negative answer. Because of the nature of Hebrew parallelism, these 2 questions should be viewed synonymously. To forget about Judah would be to forsake her to her present condition of suffering. The use of forget here is the opposite of remember, which we saw back in verse 1. God cannot forget anything. So this figure of speech means to forsake or abandon the people as though he has forgotten them. The people were asking God, why he had abandoned them for so long. And now, again, the question is based upon God's eternality of verse 19. Has he eternally forsaken the Jewish people? Well, the answer will prove to be in the negative. No, he has not forsaken the Jewish people forever. They are his covenant people, but the requirement on their part was confession of sin. Now, Moses also spelled this out in Leviticus 26, verses 40 to 42. Moses writes in Leviticus 26, 40 to 42, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their trespass, which they trespassed against me, and also that because they walked contrary unto me, I also walked contrary unto them, and brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then accepted the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. So, verse 21 is now a plea for repentance. Turn you us unto you, O Jehovah, and we shall be turned. Again, what we see here is Jeremiah's favorite word, shuv, which is turn, and turned is used here. They desired a right relationship with their God, but it was only he who could bring them into a state of reconciliation with him. So they implored God to actively return them to him, and they would return. For a change of mind on God's part would lead to a change of mind on their part. Renew our days as of old. What they're asking is, restore the old happy way of life, each man with his own vine and with his own fig tree, undisturbed by the fear of invasion and rejoicing in the sense of the favor of Jehovah. That's what they're asking. We want the old days again, Lord. Now, their ultimate hope for restoration was God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. And this is the final time that Jeremiah's favorite word, shuv or turn, is used in his writings. Now, the spark of hope that briefly appeared in verse 21 now seems to give way to depression and dismay in verse 22. However, in verse 22, the prayer ends with a possible misreading in many translations. Many translations read, but you have utterly rejected us. You are very wroth against us. And this is the translation that I'm using, the ASV. This is how it reads here, but the ESV, and I think the New American Standard reads differently. A better translation would be, unless you have completely rejected us. So if we're to look at verses 21 and 22, what he's trying to say is this: restore us and renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and remained exceedingly angry with us. That's virtually what he's trying to say here. So Judah's survivors were issuing a final appeal, which they simply based upon God's covenant-keeping nature. Remember, he's the covenant people. And this covenant nature would not allow him to ever reject his people or to totally destroy them. It is true that Jehovah was very angry against Judah, and this statement summarizes the theme of Lamentations. But his wrath was specifically targeted to punish certain transgressions and came to an end when the necessary judgment was over. Judgment was now satisfied. Israel's survival was never in question here. Now, Lamentations 5 may be summarized in two basic points. First of all, chapter 5 consists of a penitential prayer in which the sin that led to the fall of Jerusalem is confessed. Second, the request for God's forgiveness will ultimately lead to that very forgiveness. If Lamentations 5:22 were a question, as a lot of commentators contend it is, it could be formulated as follows: have you completely rejected us, and will you be angry with us forever? Now, the Apostle Paul asked a similar question in Romans 11, verse 1. Has God rejected his people? And the response is an emphatic no, he has not rejected his people. God has not abandoned his people. Israel's suffering will one day come to an end. God is still sovereign, And his covenant with Israel is not contingent upon the people's response. He made unconditional covenants with them. When the nation calls out to God and confesses its sin, he will hear it and eventually restore his people to himself, but is contingent upon them confessing their sin. And that, friends, is the end of the book of Lamentations. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.